So I'm going to do something a little bit different today. And I wanted to talk about tragedy in this sort of original sense. And in particular, I wanted to talk about Game of Thrones and Succession as we get to the Succession finale. I obviously have no idea how it's going to end. It may not end up following, the archetype and the structure of a tragedy, but it does look like it's going that way. And I've been hearing a lot of people being upset because, this is just another, it's Game of Thrones, and actually even Jeremy Strong, who plays Kendall, had said this has been Kendall's Dracarys moment, and I've seen people complaining, and they're like, "Oh, that's bad," and referencing like, "Oh, is Greg gonna be the Bran?" And I appreciate that like people are so passionate about it, but I also think I'm still very attached to Game of Thrones. I love the show. I'm way too emotionally invested in it, and the book series. I love them. But I do get frustrated a lot because there's a lot of complaints about Game of Thrones and the ending, and I loved the ending. Now, that being said, yes, it was flawed the last few seasons. They were rushed. There were things that I think just moved too quickly. There were some logistical issues, like how are you getting from place to place? Like, when is all this happening? When is this happening? Because again, and they had a lot of that in the early seasons, but they would fill that space, so while things were happening, something else was going on, and I did feel a little rushed. But I really do defend the ending, because what I feel like we really put a lot of pressure. I mean, first of all, I think there's just like a nature of we feel like stories are supposed to be crowdsourced now, and it's like we want our ending, and our ending, it's like a choose your own adventure of mass produced television, and that's not real. Like, you don't get your ending, you get the ending that the writers wanted to write. And I think one of the challenges too is that Game of Thrones is very unique in the fact that obviously they had some of the books, but they never had the rest of them, and probably wanted to have the rest of them. And I know George R. R. Martin did give certain, tips and guidelines and, a structure. And, I think that is one of the flaws, is that the writers for Game of Thrones were not bad writers. They're writing in a different medium. And, asking a screenwriter to do the work of a novel is just kind of ridiculous. And unfortunately, if they had never had any content, if they'd always only had outlines, I think it would have been consistent. Or if they had had the novels by the time the series wrapped up, it would have been consistent. But the problem is you went from a screenwriter essentially adapting a novel with tons and tons of background to a screenwriter building a script off of an outline. And there's going to be a feeling of inconsistency there. So I think, to be fair, we just need to accept the fact that, there were flaws, but there's blame to go around. But overall, the story itself, ignoring some of the logistical stuff, I think the story itself ended what I thought ended well, because I thought it followed, a traditional tragedy arc. And I think it's something that maybe we just don't have a lot of in modern fiction, or that maybe people in general, I know I love dark fiction and I love depressing things. So I read a lot of depressing books, or, watch depressing movies, a lot of indie stuff. And I think, so I feel pretty comfortable with the tragedy structure. But I do think it's something that, for most people, don't necessarily seek out things that kind of make them feel sad. And a tragedy can be kind of frustrating because, essentially your hero is not going to get what they want. Or the character you're relating to is not going to get what they want. I mean, that's just the structure of tragedy. And, in the traditional sense, a tragedy is just something that doesn't work out, and a comedy is, to simplify it, a comedy is where things do work out for the main characters. And, obviously those have evolved. But I think looking back at like the traditional tragedy structure, I want to talk about Game of Thrones and Succession and how I think they follow this very, very well, whether people like it or not necessarily. So according to Aristotle, who originally defined tragedy, a tragedy is the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude complete in itself, in appropriate and pleasurable language, in a dramatic rather than narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish a catharsis of these emotions. And so obviously you can say both Game of Thrones and Succession hit those points. I mean, it's serious, there's a magnitude, it's a complete story, it's relatable, in terms of being language, it's a dramatic structure, and there's definitely a lot of incidents that arouse pity and fear. And one of the things I think that there is a catharsis, I just sometimes think, maybe people don't know, it's not maybe the emotions they're comfortable with, but I mean, tragedy isn't supposed to necessarily make you feel good. It's just supposed to make you feel like it's cleaned out, essentially. It's like the catharsis, So, and then according to Andrew Cecil Bradley, who's a Shakespearean scholar, he kind of simplifies Shakespearean tragedy to essentially a tale of suffering and calamity conducting to death. And, in Shakespeare, that's pretty much accurate. I don't think we always have to end in death, in tragedy, but some form of death, whether it's the death of the status quo or, if it's not the death of a character, it's the death of something. But often there is a death as well. So looking at that, I mean, the first piece that's really important in a tragedy is the tragic hero, who is a main character cursed by fate and possessed of a tragic flaw. And so I think if you're looking at both Daenerys and Kendall, you can definitely say that they are tragic heroes. So for Daenerys, I mean, she's cursed by fate. Her entire life is basically, you are entitled to the throne, but also we're going to put all of these obstacles in your way, and nobody wants you to have the throne, even though, like, technically you're entitled to it. And then she finds Jon Snow, who's also entitled to the throne, probably more entitled, once we get through his whole family story. And he is really a foil to Daenerys. I mean, if they're both heroes, she's more the tragic hero. I mean, he's more like the chosen one hero. I mean, his story's not happy. But, Jon has always, throughout the story, he always sacrifices his own needs and his own wants for the greater good. And that's like constantly what he's doing. And, whereas Dany, her, like, over time, she starts to be like, but I am owed this. Like, I deserve this. And you see it making her go essentially crazy. Her pride and her feeling of, like, I deserve this. I've worked so hard to build up. And to be fair, I mean, she has. Like, Dany is not, she's not a weak character. I mean, she's been through awful things. I mean, obviously her father being murdered, being stuck out, being kind of like banished, having to build her own, she essentially built an army. I mean, she literally walked into fire, but at the same time, she is often, throughout the story, we see her making bad decisions. And, eventually those things catch up with you. And there are a lot of times, I remember early seasons and early in the books, everybody was like, I love Daenerys. She's the best. She's so cool. And don't get me wrong. I love her. She's a great character. But I'm like, I don't know that she's very likable in a lot of ways. I mean, I like her in that she's unlikable. But again, like, there she would do things and I would be like, I think she's a villain. Like I think she's at the very least an anti-hero. I mean, she's doing things that just seem awful. And it seemed like as the story was progressing, she was getting worse and worse and more determined to have what she wanted at any cost. And, that's not really heroic. I mean, it's like, it's a tragic flaw. Her pride gets in the way. And so, like, the idea that, like, this came out of nowhere was always sort of surprising to me, because I was like, I thought, like, all along, like, early in, like, in the 7th and 8th season especially, like, I was like, she's gonna go bad, right? Because, like, she just doesn't seem like she's in a good place. And I think, you understand why she breaks, but again, it's a tragic flaw. She's a tragic hero because, she essentially brings about her own destruction. And I think Kendall's the same way. And whereas, like, John is the foil for Dany, Kendall's like his own foil. So we have, like, the external conflict, but then you also have Kendall, has his internal conflict here, where, early in the seasons, in the series, he's determined to not be his father. He's like very much like, I want to be my own person. I can respect him, but I don't want to be him. I want to be a decent dad. I want to be a good person. And as we're getting to the point where I don't know if, we're watching him unravel and we're seeing maybe there isn't any good left in him, and we're slowly seeing it. And I don't know if that's how it's going to end, but it definitely looks like, and he mentioned, again, having the Dracarys moment. I definitely can see, I wouldn't be surprised in the finale if he's just like burn it all down and isolates himself and turns into Logan, essentially, and like becomes everything he never wanted to be, because his tragic flaw, we're seeing, when he was just going to step into the CEO role, it was going to be interim until the Gojo deal was done. And here we are. And the first thing, as soon as he gets a taste of it, he wants it all again. And it's dangerous for him. It was dangerous for Dany. Like, some people, power, obviously absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that's, often one of the main themes of tragedies. But I think these are two characters. You see that. And again, it's tragic. It's not, it's a sad story and it's a sad progression, but, they also kind of bring it upon themselves. So another element in tragedy is a struggle between good and evil, and it can take place as part of the plot or exist within the main character. And again, so, if Dany's not necessarily evil, but in her mind, she is good, but then other people don't see her as good, and there's so many conversations in Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire about, who is the ruler and how do people see that, there's so many discussions, and even Varys, like, he originally was like, okay, she seems like she can be the best person, but, we're constantly seeing that. And I think Succession is the same story. Really, there's no dragons, but it's a lot of the same. It's like, okay, you see elements of good in a lot of the characters, but there's often, the power being evil and, that pride. And then there's the fatal character flaw. So again, kind of touched upon those. And then tragic waste. This is a very interesting one. So the tragic waste is the good is destroyed along with the bad at the resolution of the play. So often played out with the unnecessary loss of life, especially of, quote, good guy characters. And you can't get more obvious of that than the real Dracarys moment, right? The burning of King's Landing. And that's, I think, where you see, like, it is a waste. It's an absolute waste. And it's so heartbreaking because we see Daenerys, like, make this change, and then she's so determined to be right that she's like, well, I'm going to I'm just going to keep going with it. And, and as we get into like the last episode, it's like, okay, she is literally just going to continue to lead them to war. And then, I think in the America Decides episode, we see kind of, obviously Mencken is being portrayed as being the worst possible thing for America, and Kendall knows it's the wrong thing, but eventually, like, decides on it, not because it's the right thing to do or for any reason, but he really decides on it because he's mad that Shiv lied to him. And it's kind of a disturbing moment for sure. Okay, so we have the external conflict, which is facing the hero as the result of the plot or as a bad guy. So again, Jon Snow is not the bad guy, but there is a bad guy. There's lots of bad guys, but again, who's good, who's bad? That's the best thing about both of these series is there's not really a bad guy. There's not a real villain. Like, the hero is their own villain. And that's what's so interesting about Game of Thrones. I always loved that, is that everybody was, okay, except for Ramsay, I guess. But, like, for the most part, everyone's gray, So there was, like, technically the Starks are mostly good, but it's like, it's almost like kind of disgustingly good. It's like, at some point you're like, Ned Stark, like, you're going to get your whole family killed off, like, they're doing things that they think is right, and it is the same kind of thing that Daenerys does, it's like, they're so convinced they're right. But yeah, so Jon Snow would be the external conflict mainly for Dany, because obviously she's not thinking about the people of Westeros and do they want her and do they accept her. It's really when Jon finds out he has a claim to the throne, that seems to be what sets her over the edge, because she's done all this because she was the rightful heir, and now it turns out maybe she wasn't. So Jon's really her external conflict, and obviously for Kendall it's his siblings, and I guess Tom to a lesser degree. And then there's obviously the internal conflict where they have to fight with their own fatal flaw. And so Dany, is she, like, does she give in to her frustration, her feeling of, like, I came over here, I've spent my whole life building an army, essentially, building myself up, learning to be a leader, she's gone through so many horrible things, to come here, and she's not even wanted. And does she kind of embrace that or try to sort of tone it down, or does she let her pride and her determination essentially ruin her? And it's the same with Kendall. Does he fight the urges, that he wants to prove he's enough, and a lot of it obviously is seeking, like, love and validation from his father that he's never going to get now that Logan's gone anyway, or does he just kind of give in and become his father? So the catharsis is the release of the audience's emotions through empathy with the characters, and I definitely think that's present in both shows, to the point where, like, obviously people are not as upset about, like, the endings because they didn't get catharsis. It's like sort of not knowing how to kind of process catharsis. And we don't get a lot of shows like these. We don't get a lot of tragedy in pop culture. And so I think, this is, it's unique for us. We live in a very, like, Marvel and Disney kind of world where even when things are sad, there's, Thanos does the snap, but then everyone comes back, or, most of them come back, and, like, Iron Man dies, but then, like, there's other versions of Iron Man, or, his tech still exists, and, Black Widow dies, but she gets another movie, and we get a prequel, and then we get, like, a new Black Widow, and so there's always like a feeling of there's no real like loss in a lot of like pop culture. And so I think one of the things for Game of Thrones that was so hard, I think, is that it is cathartic, but it's like we're not used to it just being awful. Like Bran becoming king makes sense, but it's not what we wanted. He's not the person we've been rooting for, and it's like, but it fits the story. And kind of reflecting on like this is kind of where things had to go, but at the same time it's hard because like that's not the ending we want. And I feel like that's maybe the case in Succession. Either Kendall does succeed to the throne essentially, but at the cost of everything, or like I don't know, the company gets bought out or something awful happens and like no one gets anything. There's not really a win though. Because no matter what happens, I think in Succession, I think we're going to see, Roman is never going to be okay. He has so much trauma that he doesn't know how to work through. The siblings have such a strong, they have a strong love and care for one another, but then they'll also stab each other in the back in a second. And at this point, they're adults. They're not going to suddenly come together and all get along, So it is cathartic, but I think we just have to kind of refocus our emotions maybe and understand, how that catharsis comes about. And then often tragedies do have comic relief, and obviously there's plenty of comedy in Game of Thrones somehow, even as awful as it can be. And Succession is hilarious even when it's awful. The lack of poetic justice. And I think this is kind of where the catharsis confusion comes in, is that things end poorly, including for the good guys. And a tragedy is not going to have that poetic justice. And I think we're so used to that we're used to good overcoming evil. And, we're used to Harry Potter. And I love Harry Potter. I'm not we're used to Star Wars, again, good wins. And so it's so hard to see something where you're like, wow, I rooted for this person and then they just became awful and it's sad. And, but that's also beautiful. We need variety, and it's so nice to have stories that have different, these different approaches. And then supernatural elements. There's more of that obviously in Game of Thrones than there is in Succession. But yeah, so that's sort of the, just a look at tragedy and how it kind of fits in both of these. And it's just I guess I'm just rambling, but I do think these are both such fantastic series, and maybe repositioning how we look at them and how we think of them, rather than, oh, I didn't like this or I didn't like this, and recognizing just how good they are and almost how unique they are, because there aren't a lot. Yellow Jackets is going on right now if you're looking for something that's also dark and miserable. But they really don't follow that sort of common mold. And HBO shows kind of don't. I know people hated The Sopranos ending for a long time, and it's great, because it's just ends. So that's sort of something that, may just be, Game of Thrones just got so big. But yeah, they're both excellent shows. And if you haven't, honestly, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones at this point, I don't know what you're doing. Stop doing whatever you're doing and go watch it, because it's amazing. And if you haven't watched Succession, you probably should, because it's fantastic as well. And you want to talk about stunning writing and acting. There's some flaws in the last few seasons of Game of Thrones in terms of rushing. And there's definitely some lines that are less than desirable in the last. Well, it's not even in, I don't think, the 7th or 8th. But there's definitely some stuff that you're like, eh. But overall, the writing and the characters and the acting, it's just it's so far above, I think, most things in pop culture. And so definitely check these shows out if you're not watching them.